The cold morning air cut through the streets of Florence as Lorenzo walked toward his appointment with destiny. He had been summoned by the most feared political advisor of his time, a man whose name would echo through centuries, whose teachings would shape empires and topple kingdoms. Niccolò Machiavelli sat in his study, surrounded by scrolls and manuscripts, his eyes gleaming with the accumulated wisdom of a lifetime spent navigating the treacherous waters of Renaissance politics. "You seek to understand power," Machiavelli began without preamble, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "But you mistake power for dominance, influence for intimidation. The man who truly stands out understands that transformation begins not with others, but within himself." Lorenzo leaned forward, eager to absorb every word. What followed was a discourse that would fundamentally alter his understanding of what it meant to be a man of consequence in a world where weakness was death and mediocrity was forgotten. The foundation of fearsome respect. The first lesson emerged from Machiavelli's recounting of Cesare Borgia's rise to power. "Observe," the master said, tracing his finger across a map of medieval Italy, "how Borgia commanded both love and fear, but, when forced to choose, he chose fear. Yet this was not the crude fear of a tyrant, but the calculated respect born of predictable strength." The transformation into a man who stands out begins with the cultivation of what Machiavelli termed fearsome respect, a quality that combines unwavering principles with the demonstrated capability to enforce them. This is not about becoming cruel or tyrannical, but about developing an unshakable core that others recognize and respect, even when they disagree with your methods or decisions. Consider the merchant who had built his reputation on absolute honesty in an age of widespread corruption. When competitors attempted to undermine him through spreading false rumors about his character, he did not respond with equal deception. Instead, he methodically documented every instance of their dishonesty and presented this evidence to their mutual clients with devastating precision. His reputation for truthfulness became so ironclad that his word alone could determine the success or failure of business ventures throughout the city. This merchant understood that reputation is not built through grand gestures but through consistent, predictable behavior that others learn they can count on, whether that reliability works for or against their interests. The man who transforms himself into someone who stands out recognizes that his word must become law in his own domain, and that this law must be enforced with unwavering consistency. Machiavelli's correspondence reveals his deep understanding of human nature. People crave predictability even when they dislike the predictor. The leader who changes his positions based on convenience may win temporary favor but loses long-term respect. The man undergoing true transformation learns to make his character so consistent that others can predict his responses to any given situation, and this predictability becomes a form of power. The process of developing fearsome respect requires the systematic elimination of inconsistency from one's character. Every promise made must be kept or the consequences clearly explained. Every boundary established must be maintained without exception. Every principle declared must be lived without compromise. This creates a gravitational field around the individual that others cannot ignore, whether they admire him or not. But Machiavelli warned against confusing this with rigidity. "The oak that cannot bend breaks in the storm," he noted, "but the oak that bends while maintaining its roots survives to grow stronger." Fearsome respect requires adaptability in methods while maintaining absolute consistency in core principles. The man who stands out learns to navigate changing circumstances while never compromising the fundamental values that define his character. The transformation involves developing what modern observers might call emotional sovereignty, the ability to remain centered and consistent regardless of external pressures. When others rage, you remain calm. When others panic, you remain thoughtful. When others abandon their principles for temporary advantage, you demonstrate why principles exist in the first place. This emotional sovereignty manifests in practical ways. In negotiations, you never reveal desperation even when stakes are high. In conflicts, you never respond from emotion even when personally attacked. In opportunities, you never abandon your standards even when potential gains are substantial. Others begin to recognize that you operate according to laws they can understand and predict, even if they cannot manipulate or control you. The merchant's story illustrates another crucial aspect of fearsome respect, the willingness to accept short-term costs for long-term positioning. When he chose to confront his competitors directly rather than engaging in their game of deception, he risked immediate retaliation and potential business losses. However, his consistent adherence to truth-telling in an environment of widespread dishonesty eventually made him the most trusted and sought-after partner in his industry. Machiavelli observed that most men fail in their transformation because they seek immediate returns on their character investments. They behave honorably when it's convenient and abandon honor when it becomes costly. This intermittent approach prevents the development of true fearsome respect because others learn they cannot rely on such behavior under pressure. The man undergoing genuine transformation accepts that building unshakable character requires enduring temporary disadvantages. He may lose short-term opportunities because he refuses to compromise his standards. He may face criticism for maintaining unpopular positions. He may endure financial costs for keeping his word when circumstances change. But these temporary costs compound into permanent advantages as others recognize they are dealing with someone whose character has been tested and proven reliable. This reliability extends beyond mere honesty to encompass every aspect of one's dealings with others. Punctuality becomes absolute, not because of social convention, but because your word about when you will arrive becomes a demonstration of your character. Confidentiality becomes inviolable, not because of legal requirements, but because others must know that information shared with you is secure. Follow-through becomes automatic, not because of external enforcement, but because your commitments become extensions of your identity. The transformation requires recognizing that reputation is not built through self-promotion but through consistent demonstration of character. The man who constantly speaks of his integrity undermines his credibility, while the man who simply demonstrates integrity consistently allows others to draw their own conclusions about his character. This demonstrates understanding of another Machiavellian principle, that perception of power often matters more than power itself, and that perception is best shaped through action rather than words. As Lorenzo absorbed these lessons, he began to understand that fearsome respect was not about inspiring terror but about inspiring certainty, the certainty that you would behave according to your stated principles regardless of external pressures. This certainty made you valuable to allies who knew they could count on your support, and formidable to enemies who knew they could not count on your weakness. The foundation of standing out, therefore, lies not in being different for the sake of difference, but in being so reliably consistent in your character that others must acknowledge your strength whether they like you or not. This fearsome respect becomes the bedrock upon which all other forms of influence and leadership are built. The architecture of strategic influence. Machiavelli's second discourse began at dawn the following day, with Lorenzo finding his teacher examining a chessboard where the pieces had been arranged in an unusual configuration. Power, Machiavelli said without looking up, is not about moving your own pieces, but about understanding how all pieces move, including those that belong to your opponents. The transformation into a man who stands out requires mastering what Machiavelli called the architecture of strategic influence, the systematic understanding of how decisions ripple through social, professional, and political networks. This involves developing the ability to see several moves ahead while maintaining flexibility to adapt when others make unexpected choices. The story Machiavelli told was of a young diplomat who had been assigned to negotiate a treaty between two warring city-states. Rather than focusing solely on the immediate terms of the agreement, this diplomat spent weeks understanding the broader context, the economic pressures facing each city, the personal motivations of their leaders, the influence of merchants and guilds, and the potential reactions of neighboring powers. When negotiations began, while other diplomats argued over specific clauses, this young man demonstrated his understanding of each party's deeper needs. To the first city, he offered assurance that the treaty would not prevent them from expanding trade routes to the east, something not directly related to the immediate conflict but crucial to their long-term prosperity. To the second city, he proposed a face-saving mechanism that would allow their leader to claim victory while actually accepting terms favorable to the first city. The treaty was not only successful but became a model for future diplomatic arrangements. More importantly, both cities began requesting this diplomat for future negotiations, and other powers started seeking his counsel on their own diplomatic challenges. His reputation for understanding the complete picture rather than just immediate objectives made him indispensable. This story illustrates the principle that strategic influence requires thinking in systems rather than isolated incidents. The man transforming himself into someone who stands out learns to map the networks of relationships, dependencies, and motivations that surround any situation. He understands that every decision creates ripple effects, and that true influence comes from understanding these ripples better than others do. Strategic influence begins with developing what Machiavelli termed three-dimensional vision, the ability to see not just the immediate participants in any situation, but the broader ecosystem that influences their behavior. In business negotiations, this means understanding not just what each party says they want, but what pressures they face from their own stakeholders, what alternatives they have, and what consequences they fear most. The transformation involves cultivating information networks that extend far beyond your immediate circle. This is not about gathering gossip or secrets, but about developing a systematic understanding of how different parts of your professional and social environment connect and influence each other. The man who stands out becomes known for his ability to provide context and perspective that others miss. Consider the case of a manager who was facing resistance to a new company policy. Rather than simply implementing the policy through authority, he spent time understanding the specific concerns of different departments. He discovered that the marketing team's resistance stemmed from fear that the policy would slow their response to client requests, while the accounting team's concerns centered on compliance complications. Instead of addressing these concerns piecemeal, he redesigned the implementation to include a fast-track approval process for marketing's urgent needs and an automated compliance checking system for accounting. By understanding the systemic nature of the resistance rather than treating it as simple obstinacy, he not only successfully implemented the policy but strengthened his reputation as a leader who understood the complexities of organizational dynamics. This approach required patience and systematic thinking rather than quick fixes. The manager spent weeks mapping the relationships between different departments, understanding their workflows, and identifying where the new policy would create friction. This investment of time and mental energy paid dividends not only in the immediate situation but in establishing him as someone who could navigate complex organizational challenges. Machiavelli emphasized that strategic influence also requires understanding timing and sequencing. The same proposal presented at different times or in different orders can produce completely different results. The man undergoing transformation learns to read the rhythms of his environment, when people are receptive to new ideas, when they are defensive, when they are looking for leadership, and when they prefer to be left alone. The diplomat's success came partly from his timing. He initiated his deeper research during a period when both cities were exhausted from conflict and their leaders were beginning to look for honorable ways to end hostilities. Had he attempted the same approach during the height of their anger, his questions about broader context might have been seen as irrelevant or intrusive. Strategic influence requires developing the ability to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously. While maintaining your own objectives and principles, you must be able to genuinely understand how situations look from other viewpoints. This is not about agreeing with everyone, but about understanding their reasoning well enough to predict their responses and design approaches that account for their concerns. The transformation involves moving beyond zero-sum thinking to what Machiavelli called abundance creation, finding ways to expand the overall value available so that your success does not require others' failure. This approach often proves more sustainable than approaches based purely on competition or domination. The young diplomat exemplified this principle by recognizing that both cities had interests that extended beyond their immediate conflict. By incorporating these broader interests into the treaty terms, he created a framework where both parties could achieve important objectives even while making concessions on the immediate dispute. This approach made him valuable to both sides and established his reputation as someone who could find solutions others missed. Developing strategic influence also requires what Machiavelli called patient positioning, the willingness to take seemingly less advantageous positions in the short term in order to create superior long-term opportunities. This might mean accepting smaller immediate gains in order to build relationships that will prove valuable in future situations, or supporting others' initiatives in order to establish reciprocal obligations. The manager who successfully implemented the new policy demonstrated patient positioning by spending time understanding others' concerns rather than simply pushing through his immediate objective. This approach took longer and required more energy, but it established him as a collaborative leader rather than an autocratic one, opening doors for future cooperation that would not have been available through a more forceful approach. Strategic influence culminates in what Machiavelli described as invisible leadership, the ability to shape outcomes without appearing to control the process. Others begin implementing your ideas because they genuinely believe these ideas serve their interests, not because they have been coerced or manipulated. This form of influence proves more sustainable than approaches based on authority or pressure because it creates genuine buy-in rather than mere compliance. The diplomat achieved invisible leadership when both cities began consulting him on matters beyond the original treaty. They sought his perspective not because he held formal authority over them, but because they had experienced the value of his systematic approach to complex problems. Similarly, the manager found that other departments began bringing their challenges to him because they had learned he could help them find solutions that served their interests while advancing broader organizational objectives. As Lorenzo contemplated these lessons, he began to understand that strategic influence was not about manipulation or control, but about developing such a sophisticated understanding of how systems work that you could find points of leverage others missed. The man who stands out becomes known not for his ability to force outcomes, but for his ability to see possibilities and create value that others cannot perceive. The mastery of calculated vulnerability. On the third day, Machiavelli met Lorenzo in his garden, where he was tending to grapevines with meticulous care. "Observe how the vine grows," he said, gently guiding a young shoot along a trellis. "It appears vulnerable, bending with the wind, yet it produces fruit that the rigid oak cannot. Strength without apparent weakness is brittle. True power lies in understanding when to show vulnerability and when to demonstrate strength." This final lesson proved the most counterintuitive and dangerous of Machiavelli's teachings. The transformation into a man who stands out requires mastering what he called calculated vulnerability, the strategic revelation of limitations, uncertainties, and human imperfections in service of greater influence and connection. This is perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of personal transformation because it requires both supreme confidence and precise judgment. Machiavelli told of a general who had never lost a battle but found himself increasingly isolated from his own troops and fellow commanders. His perfect record, while impressive, had created a barrier between him and others who felt they could not relate to someone who never showed doubt or difficulty. When he finally faced a truly challenging enemy, he discovered that his isolation had cost him the intelligence networks and loyal support he needed to succeed. Recognizing this pattern, the general began occasionally sharing his strategic concerns with his lieutenants, asking for their input on complex decisions, and acknowledging when their local knowledge proved superior to his theoretical understanding. Rather than diminishing his authority, this approach strengthened his relationships and improved his access to information. His troops began fighting with greater commitment because they felt included in his decision-making process rather than merely following orders. The key insight is that calculated vulnerability creates connection and trust in ways that constant strength cannot. When others see you as invulnerable, they cannot relate to your experience and, therefore, cannot feel genuine loyalty or affection. They may follow you from fear or respect, but they will not go beyond the minimum required because they feel no emotional bond with someone whose experience seems completely foreign to their own. However, Machiavelli emphasized that this vulnerability must be calculated rather than indiscriminate. The general did not share his deepest fears or reveal information that would compromise military operations. Instead, he showed professional uncertainty in areas where consultation would improve outcomes and personal humanity in moments when connection would strengthen relationships. The transformation requires developing exquisite judgment about when vulnerability serves your objectives and when it undermines them. With subordinates, showing uncertainty about complex decisions can demonstrate humility and create opportunities for them to contribute value. With rivals, the same uncertainty might signal weakness and invite attack. With superiors, controlled vulnerability can demonstrate trustworthiness and self-awareness, while excessive vulnerability can suggest incompetence or instability. Consider the story of a young lawyer who had built her reputation on thorough preparation and aggressive advocacy. While this approach served her well in courtroom battles, she found that clients often felt intimidated by her intensity and colleagues viewed her as unapproachable. Recognizing that her professional success was beginning to limit her career advancement, she began experimenting with controlled vulnerability. In client meetings, she started acknowledging when cases presented genuine challenges and explaining her thinking process rather than simply presenting conclusions. She asked clients about their priorities and concerns rather than assuming she understood their objectives. With colleagues, she began sharing credit for successes and occasionally asking for advice on matters outside her expertise. These changes initially felt risky because they contradicted her established pattern of projecting complete confidence and control. However, the results exceeded her expectations. Clients began referring more business because they felt she genuinely understood their situations. colleagues started including her in collaborative opportunities because they found her approachable and intellectually honest. Her vulnerability, carefully deployed, had enhanced rather than undermined her influence. The lawyer's experience illustrates another crucial aspect of calculated vulnerability: it must be genuine rather than manipulative. People can sense when someone is pretending to be uncertain or humble as a tactic. The vulnerability must reflect real aspects of your experience and genuine respect for others' perspectives. This authenticity distinguishes calculated vulnerability from manipulation and explains why it creates lasting rather than temporary influence. Machiavelli warned against the opposite extreme as well. Some people mistake constant vulnerability for authenticity and end up undermining their own authority through excessive self-revelation. The man undergoing transformation must learn to maintain what he called selective opacity, being genuinely open about some aspects of his experience while maintaining privacy and mystery about others. The balance requires understanding that vulnerability serves specific purposes: creating connection, gathering information, building trust, and demonstrating humanity. When vulnerability serves these purposes, it should be deployed carefully and strategically. When it serves no constructive purpose or when it might compromise your position or effectiveness, discretion becomes the better choice. Strategic vulnerability also extends to admitting mistakes and limitations. The man who stands out learns to acknowledge errors quickly and completely, taking responsibility without making excuses or shifting blame. This approach, while seeming to invite criticism, actually strengthens credibility because others recognize that someone who can admit mistakes is more likely to be trustworthy about other matters. The general's transformation included acknowledging when his initial strategies proved inadequate and revising his plans based on new information. Rather than stubbornly persisting with failing approaches to preserve his image of infallibility, he demonstrated that his commitment to success exceeded his ego investment in being right. This flexibility made his eventual successes more impressive and his leadership more effective. However, admitting mistakes requires what Machiavelli called forward momentum, the ability to learn from errors and demonstrate improvement. Simply acknowledging failures without showing growth creates an impression of incompetence rather than humility. The vulnerability must be coupled with evidence that you can learn, adapt, and improve your performance based on feedback and experience. The lawyer exemplified forward momentum by not only acknowledging when her initial approach to a case proved inadequate but by developing new strategies that incorporated lessons learned from the experience. Clients and colleagues observed that she became more effective over time precisely because she could acknowledge and correct her limitations rather than repeating the same mistakes. Calculated vulnerability requires understanding the difference between sharing struggles and sharing defeats. Talking about challenges you are working to overcome can create connection and demonstrate resilience. Talking about problems that have overwhelmed you can create the impression of incompetence or instability. The man transforming himself learns to frame difficulties as opportunities for growth rather than evidence of inadequacy. This framing requires genuine personal development rather than merely clever presentation. You cannot sustainably project growth and learning if you are not actually engaged in these processes. The vulnerability must be backed by real effort to understand your limitations, seek improvement, and implement changes based on feedback and experience. The ultimate goal of calculated vulnerability is to become what Machiavelli termed approachably formidable, someone who commands respect and demonstrates competence while remaining accessible and relatable to others. This combination proves more powerful than either pure intimidation or excessive friendliness because it creates the conditions for both professional effectiveness and personal loyalty. As Lorenzo reflected on these three lessons, fearsome respect, strategic influence, and calculated vulnerability, he began to understand that transformation into a man who stands out required not choosing between strength and humanity, but integrating them in ways that served both personal effectiveness and genuine relationships with others. The path forward would require constant attention to balance, timing, and authenticity, but it promised to lead to a form of influence that was both powerful and sustainable. Machiavelli's final words carried the weight of a lifetime spent observing power and its effects. Remember that the greatest leaders in history were not those who inspired only fear or only love, but those who earned both in proper measure. Your transformation is not complete when others simply notice you, but when they cannot imagine important decisions being made without your input. Become indispensable not through dependency, but through the irreplaceable value you bring to every situation you enter. The morning sun cast long shadows across the garden as Lorenzo departed, carrying with him not just knowledge, but a framework for becoming the kind of man whose influence would persist long after his physical presence was gone. The transformation ahead would be neither quick nor easy, but the path had been illuminated by one of history's most astute observers of human nature and political reality. In the years that followed, Lorenzo would discover that Machiavelli's teachings proved their worth not in their cleverness but in their practical effectiveness. The combination of unwavering character, systematic thinking, and strategic humanity created opportunities and relationships that pure aggression or naive idealism could never have achieved. He learned that standing out was not about being different, but about being better, more thoughtful, more reliable, more valuable than those around him. The dark lessons were dark not because they were evil, but because they acknowledged the complex realities of human nature and social dynamics that more optimistic philosophies often ignored. By understanding and working with these realities rather than against them, the man who sought to stand out could achieve both personal success and positive impact on those around him. The transformation was complete not when others feared or loved him, but when they could not imagine facing significant challenges without him.